Debating art motions. Okay, this is a presentation about how to debate art motions. Those are self-explanatory about what they are. They are motions that are about art or have art in them, or you can talk about art. Got it? Good. Generally speaking, art motions are a pretty good assessment of a debater's capacity to do pretty basic things like tracking or weighing. But this is a guide to some of the important things, and then also I've got some listed examples, and then within that some discussion points about the usefulness of talking about art in a sort of diverse sense, rather talking about diversity that exists within art as a general concept. I've also included some fun art to decorate the presentation. I have referenced them, but I think that my head is in the way, and I would change that, but I don't know how. Every art motion is the same unless they're not. I think that people generally think that all art motions are the same for a reason. Pretty much a lot of the time you are actually going to be ending up with very similar sort of clashes and argumentation coming out in a lot of debates. The issue is that means that the finities are in the details, right? Like, it's important that you understand the ways that this motion is maybe different from the last art motion that you did, and because oftentimes people will use things like stock analysis and actually miss the debate because they've not tailored it to be towards that particular thing. So whilst you're usually practicing or discussing along similar talking points, it's important that you make sure that you're like on the level of each motion. So, but that being said, like, clashes are often quite predictable. So here are some of the clashes that I generally see come up most of the time when I do an art motion. The first is impacts on minority communities. So whether that means that those minority communities are explicitly referenced in a debate, or in the motion, or if they just end up coming out. I think that oftentimes you will look at things like art motions and see, well, how does this impact the most vulnerable people in society, which is a kind of piece of analysis that comes out a lot in debating, and oftentimes that looks like a minorities community's capacity to either capitalize on their art or create art or be received or have their artwork valued in some kind of sense. And so a lot of times argumentation will center around that. But it's not just minority communities, it's also vulnerable communities. Later on I've got a list of motions and we'll discuss this in a bit more detail, but maybe there's a community of individuals who are particularly harmed by certain things, and art is a useful way of representing that, whether that's art that is kind of dealing with difficult themes or difficult emotional themes. That's a kind of interesting way of just talking about it. The second clash is accessibility of reception or accessibility of creation of art. Maybe these are two different clashes, but I think a lot of times there's a discussion within the debate about how are people capable of looking at art, so whether that's, you know, free galleries or film tickets, or how are people capable to create art, whether that's, you know, ensuring that they have galleries of buying from new artists rather than just trading old pieces, or that's you know, providing people with the tools or skills necessary, like giving music lessons to young children. That kind of thing is important to talk about. Thirdly, and potentially also fourthly, enjoyment of art. I think that this is actually a more important clash than a lot of people give it credit for. This is my favourite thing to talk about in art motions, is the capacity of people to just enjoy art. I think that oftentimes, and we'll get into this later, a lot of people feel a need to make these kind of motions much more significant than they actually are, when in reality, if I'm sitting down in the evening and watching some TV or reading a book, I rarely do it with some kind of intention of like some political intention or, you know, social cultural intention. Generally speaking, I'm doing it because I want to just sit down and enjoy a good piece of media. You'll critique my taste probably as we go through and see more of the kinds of art that I like. But generally speaking, I think the majority of people engage with these things in a way that is not supposed to be political, or rather, that's not the only way that people engage with things. People can do things just purely for enjoyment, and therefore I think that, like, if you can prove that this motion or like whatever means that people are more likely or less likely to just enjoy art, I think that that is actually a valuable clash within a debate, and I think that weighing is really important there. And then fourthly, freedom of expression. I put freedom in like little quotation thingies for no real reason other than I think that this clash is generally like a principled clash. It's like the capacity of people to express themselves properly. It's relevant mainly for sort of Woods motions, like policy motions, but oftentimes I think that it's actually incredibly difficult to do this properly or well, and I've rarely seen people win debates with this. So I think particularly when you're just getting started in BP debating, I would be wary about just flagging something as a violation of someone's freedom of expression, because without doing the legwork to prove that that's a valuable principle, that's not important in a debate. And I think there are more easy or more achievable burdens that can be done in most debates. The other thing about debates being art motions being reasonably predictable is that the mistakes that people make are also often predictable. You can capitalize on this when you're rebutting or doing some weighing. So there are sort of three main ways that people sort of fail. The first of which is overreaching and burdens. I'll get into that in more detail about that in a second, but essentially just people try and like solve things that are impossible to solve with art. The second is improper tracking of arguments. This looks like people just not really listening in a debate and saying that people didn't prove things that they did, or just not really following the discussion that's happening, and therefore like just missing out on kind of key rebuttal points. I think that when motions are either shallow or it's difficult to prove the big things, and so everything's about the little things, it becomes significantly more important to track. Again, I'll get into more detail about that in a second. And then thirdly, and probably as I think quite significantly, the ignoring of like crucial avenues or types of art. Oftentimes there's a tendency to just talk about things like the Mona Lisa. It gets thrown around a lot in art motions, when in reality the majority of people's interaction with artwork in the modern day is actually not with that, right? Like I think most people are listening to music on a daily basis and watching TV or reading books or seeing kind of pop posters kind of stuff far more than they are engaging with things that are like fine art or traditional art forms. Like not everyone has the capacity to go to the theatre every day, or not everyone has the capacity or desire to go to art museums, and therefore I think that it's important that you think about the actual art that people are interacting with on a more regular basis. So that being said, here is a handy dandy guide to some art forms which are useful to reference. I've given an example in each. I think that actually you don't need to know anything about any of these things. I'll give you a brief overview, but if you feel like you need to refer to some kind of pieces of art beyond just like the traditional fine art or paintings basically, then this is useful. This is not an exhaustive list by any stretch of the imagination. There are things that exist in art that I have not included here. This is just the things that came immediately to mind that I personally have referenced within debates before and that I think are useful. So I'll go through from sort of left to right, and just give you a brief introduction to each piece that I've got here, and hopefully that's useful in terms of just having a better understanding of the kinds of things that you can reference. If you know a lot about art, or if you think this is not useful, then you can skip this slide and go to the next slide. I will not give you a timestamp because I cannot be bothered. Cool. Okay. Top left, this is a painting by Paul Klee. It's called Landschaft in Blau, or Landscape in Blue in English. Klee is a Swiss-German artist. He was hugely influential on modern artwork in the sort of Cubism or Expressionism. And I think that, it's probably unlikely that you'll reference him, but I think that this is like a kind of example of modern or sort of more modern traditional artwork. He was influenced a lot by his specific circumstances in life and upbringing, and so artists like him and this kind of traditional artwork are quite useful to reference. I put this in because this is my favourite of his paintings, but actually he's done a lot of paintings of angels, and so in debates where it's talking about suffering in the last year of his life, Paul Klee suffered from quite a invasive disease, and then he eventually died from it, and it was incredibly painful. And in that year space he painted I think 50 like images of angels, and it's an interesting discussion about the portrayal of suffering through artwork. So yeah, just an example of the fact that you can reference that kind of traditional artwork in terms of an artist's influence or the kind of catharsis that they get from their own creation. Underneath that is a poster from the National Theatre's production of Amadeus by Peter Schaffer. this is, I mean, it was a phenomenal production. It's still on the National Theatre website if you want to go and watch it. But the interesting thing is that playing Salieri, the lead role was Lucian Masmati, and obviously Salieri, German, Austrian, Italian, probably Italian given the name. I don't know. Salieri, the musician composer, was obviously a white man, and this National Theatre production selected Lucian Masmati to play him, who's clearly in the poster a black actor, and this was an example and can be used as an example of how a production uses or subverts the traditional casting expectations. And actually, this production of Amadeus did not do it as a political stunt within the play itself. Lucian Masmati is a director of a very influential theatre company that centres itself around the promotion and inclusion of black actors within the theatre community. But that was not why he was selected. He was just incredibly talented, I think. I think that wasn't why he was selected. Obviously, other examples include things like Hamilton, which deliberately casts ethnic minority actors only, other than the king. And so these are both examples of plays that do non-traditional casting of roles, and therefore receive like either critiques or praise for doing so. And it can be useful to reference things like that as an example of the capacity of individuals who see themselves or see very few roles available to them, therefore capable of accessing more roles within theatre, or films or whatever. And it's important to see how that can be influential on individuals watching it, like the fact that, you know, young African Americans watching Hamilton were hugely influenced, and kind of therefore see themselves in the theatre community, which they've traditionally been quite excluded from. Interesting sort of example there. Moving to the next column, on the top is a poster for the video game The Elder Scrolls V Skyrim, by Bethesda. This is hugely influential. I would argue probably one of the most influential video games that have been made. It's a single player open world video game, and I actually think that it's mainly here to reference the fact that video games are actually a really important form of artwork, and given the interactive capacity, you play characters, you can develop yourself an understanding of things, whether that's things as simple as like The Sims, where you get to kind of create characters and then let them drown in swimming pools, or if it's things like Skyrim, where you explore this kind of open world, or if it's other kinds of video games where you potentially have to explore yourself more. I'm forgetting the name. That one about, there's a video game which is about it's gonna really, hold on. Okay, I've literally just sat and thought for like a minute. It's called Detroit Become Human, and that in that video game, it's you can't go back on any of your previous saves, and so it's all about exploring the way that you react to immediate circumstances, and it causes quite a lot of self-reflection in people. And there's a lot of other games that are like that, and so I think that video games are quite a useful example that you can use about the capacity of people to understand themselves. This is centered on like the single player video games. I'll get onto like the multiplayer online games in a second, because I think there's a whole other world, but just in terms of like art and the capacity to express oneself, it's not just actually the people who create art who get to express themselves. It's also, you know, through things like video games, the people who consume art who get to understand themselves better and express themselves through that. And I think that's really important. Underneath that, bit of a juxtaposition. This is La Venedita by Frida Kahlo. It means like little deer, I think. Frida Kahlo was a Mexican painter. She was inspired and hugely influenced by Mexican identity as a concept and indigenous art forms, and a lot of her artwork is very representative of that. She mainly did self-portraits, and also a lot of her portraits were depictions of her own kind of pain and suffering. She had a bit of a difficult upbringing, in terms of she got polio when she was young. She recovered, but she sort of suffered sort of lifelong ailments because of that. And then, you know, she got hit by a bus, I think, when she was 18, which prevented her then from going to medical school. So a lot of her paintings are centered around her experiencing of pain and suffering. Her art was actually not very popular until it was sort of rediscovered in the 1970s, when it then also became adopted by a lot of movements. Most, I think, importantly or famously, the feminist movement has adopted Frida Kahlo as a representative image, as it offers kind of an unapologetic portrait of femininity and female pain, and that kind of female experience of suffering. And so the feminist movement often uses images of Frida Kahlo or Frida Kahlo's paintings in that way. But additionally, I think the Mexican identity aspect of her artwork and the indigenous influence on her all centers herself as inherently just like a kind of portrayal of Mexican identity, and representative of that and that period. And I think that means that it's also useful as an understanding in that sense. To the next column again, sort of to an extent building off of that, the peace sign is included here because it's a sort of icon of a movement, or rather, I mean, it's been adopted in a lot of ways, but the peace sign sort of, I might be making this up, originated with or became significantly popular in the 60s by that kind of like freedom-loving peace movement that took place. But generally speaking, it's here as representative of like any kind of iconography, whether that's like the sickle, the hammer and sickle for the communist movement, or the fist for the BLM movement. Iconography is actually a really important form of artwork, just given the things that it can represent. This also looks like things like flags, flag burning and that kind of thing are really important expressions of a political belief. And so I think to a certain extent, art is a lot more significant than just like pretty things on a page. A lot of time it can represent something hugely significant to people, whether that's the feminist movement using Frida Kahlo, or people adopting iconography or signs to represent their kind of movement in that sense. And then just below that, this is a portrait of Bach sitting at an organ. This is generally here because I think that music is also important to include. I actually don't love Bach, but I think that fine arts in terms of like paintings and that kind of snobbery can also extend to things like music, with classical music being deemed as something that is more representative of and accessible and classy for people who are of huge money or like traditionally from a lot of money. Excuse me. And I think that it's important to understand the accessibility of artwork in that kind of cultural and class sense. And that definitely interlinks with things like racial snobbery. But it's also important to understand actually, and I think that Bach is a good example of this, the capacity of people to access artwork from a young age, because I think that oftentimes things like music lessons are only available or more available to individuals or children whose parents have money to pay for lessons, and therefore things like the appreciation of whether this is classical music or the playing of jazz or that kind of thing, I think oftentimes is about whether or not parents are willing or capable of allowing their children to access that in some kind of practical sense. And so being able to play art and play things like music or do things like paint, I think a lot of the times dependent on the financial background of individuals, and that's also, I think, an important consideration. Moving then again to the next column, this is a collation of some of the most popular manga books that exist. I think that manga is just a useful way to talk about the fact that art exists in a lot of different forms again. This is, I mean, manga is a traditional, well, not traditional, manga is like a popular kind of Japanese based book style. Manga is actually and I think this is kind of a fun example that you can use. It's actually a really useful way of teaching kids who find reading quite difficult. So either if they struggle with, they have like attention deficits, or if they're dyslexic, things like teaching kids to read through manga is actually proven to be quite a useful way of getting them to engage more with literature, or incentivizing them to read. And so I think that these things that are like non-traditional things always have those kinds of impacts. Whether or not you use that in a debate, I think is dependent, I guess, on the debate, and also whether or not you remember this video. But I just think that it's interesting, the fact that things like manga can exist. But also I just think that manga is something that is originated in Japan but is becoming more and more popular across the world. And a lot of manga is actually written and drawn now by, for example, British or American authors, and therefore it's that way that kind of different cultures adopt or co-opt different kinds of artwork form. Below that is an image of BTS, which is a popular K-pop band. I think this is here just because, I mean, they're a hugely influential band. They've created a hugely influential fan base, and I think that's really important to understand, is just the capacity of people like pop music groups of creating dedicated audiences and fans. But I also wanted to include BTS just because of the economic potential and importance that they have. BTS has been hugely important in the spreading of K-pop across the world, but also therefore the South Korean economy is been hugely influenced by just BTS alone, let alone the rest of the kind of K-pop groups. And so the particular context for this is that BTS have recently, I think they've gone on a break because there was a huge debate about whether or not they were going to be subjected to the conscription that exists in South Korea. That's military conscription, where you have to go. You have to join the military for a certain period of time. I can't remember how long it is, at some point before you turn 30. And because these are all Korean nationals, obviously, they are also all supposed to be subjected to that. And one of the members of the band was going to turn 30, and there was a huge debate about whether or not they were going to the South Korean government was willing to postpone this, or whether they were going to keep it. There ended up being like a referendum or something in the country. I don't know a huge amount of detail about it, but the fact that they were so important to the Korean economy was influential in whether or not they were going to get an exemption from military conscription. And then they originally, and they've decided now themselves that they will just go and do their conscription service. And so they're on a break. And I think that has had an impact on the economy in South Korea. So it's also important to understand just the huge amount of money and economic potential that these kind of pop groups or cultural importance of celebrities. But that goes beyond just economic or kind of individual political things, and can be hugely important in terms of the capacity of political movements to be successful. The favourite example is Joanna Lumley. Was a huge proponent of the Gurkha Justice campaign in Britain, and was therefore quite influential in that campaign achieving its success, just because of that endorsement and the level of support from people that she brought with that is significant. So I think that art, music and TV and films all create celebrities, and therefore that is influential in the capacity of the influence that those people have, both in terms of just like economic potential, political influence, but also just social influence. Like if you see a celebrity like Taylor Swift wears a cardigan and now it's like the higher fashion kind of thing, that's the kind of influence we're talking about. And so that is important to recognize that actually artwork can be significant. Moving then to the next column, final column. On the top, this is a poster for the League of Legends, which is an online game. Don't play it. And I think that the culture that's created around these kind of online games, and communities can form around them, are really important as a kind of impact of artwork that happens, right? Like whether it's playing a lot with people online, doing playing with people across Discord, that's also really important. But also like these games have subcultures created around them. People can really invest themselves within these games. But there's also like positive and negative communication that happens across this. Whilst some people might make some friends through things like League of Legends, other people have some really negative conversations and can have some really negative insults thrown at them. And I think that's also important to understand, is the way that these kinds of games potentially endorse horrific language and communication styles that may or may not translate into the real world, and like you know what I mean. And so that I think is also important, is the way that these online games happen. But the other thing that is important to understand is that online games also have like their own sports leagues, and people can get a lot of money from being very good at these games. I think the League of Legends is an example of a game that has its own sports league, and that people can, it's streamed and watched, and people build a rapport around this, but also an economic advantage. And that's also important, is that sometimes you'll get debate motions that center around esports. kind of things and that sort of thing. So it's important to just be aware that that is the case. And then below that is a poster for season 4 of Glee, which is a popular TV show from like a while ago now. But it's quite a good example of like the way that a TV show that is tailored for and advertised to you know, sort of adolescents, teenagers, can be quite influential in the way that a lot of people then grow up. I mean, Glee was hugely popular when it was out. I think it's still quite popular. You see a lot of people referencing things that were on there. And the reason that I've included it is because Glee explicitly talked about a lot of like non-traditional things that sometimes a lot of TV shows or a lot of things shy away from. Like it talked about questioning sexuality, questioning gender identity, quite a long time before those things were, you know, popular to be talked about within media. And I think that it was also like hugely important in terms of a diversity of representation. There was a lot of, or there was some, which at the time was unusual, you know, sexuality diversity, ethnic diversity, and it covered a lot of things really badly, but it also covered things which I think was quite influential at the time. But I think more importantly is just how did things like Glee that are catered to young adults shape their view of things and kind of change them potentially going forward. Because I think that if you're young and you're consuming things like TV shows or films or theatre or books, it's possible that those things can be quite influential in the way that you view the world. So I guess the conclusion of this side is just that it's important not just to talk about things like the Mona Lisa, which is a huge tendency in art motions, but rather to talk about a huge variety of things. And like I say, there's things that I haven't covered here, like Bollywood or Nollywood, religious artwork, and all of these things are crucially important. But I think that it's just useful to have a couple of examples up your sleeve and to be aware of the fact that art can encompass a huge variety of things when we're doing art motions. Okay, back to explicitly talking about like debate stuff. So cool. The main thing in debates about art is to understand the achievable burdens and then, you know, achieve them. So I think that it's necessary for you to understand the things that are easy to prove or capable to be proven within a debate. Like a debate about art is not going to end racism, so you shouldn't say that it will. Or like end the existence of like an authoritarian regime. Like these are things that are just not going to happen. So trying to hit those big burdens is just impossible. You need to be realistic about the way that art is going to be influential, or the motion is actually going to take place. And I think that people oftentimes see things like let's talk about minority communities and their capacity to access art, and are like, yes, this is the capacity of minority communities to prevent themselves from experiencing racism. And it's like, you know what, that's actually not going to happen. So don't get tempted by those things. Make sure that you understand the actual way that this can be achieved. And I think that this means that you've got to look at like individuals and the way that individuals are going to be interacting. That's generally speaking the most important way of looking at it. So then you do what I think is called minimizing the debate. Does that actually do anything? Why not? Who do we care about? How will they be impacted? Will they be impacted at all? Who's consuming or producing art? These are all questions that you need to ask yourself, and it's different for each debate, and I'm not going to try and answer them, but I think they're all important. And then I just think that it's important that you understand that actually, you know what, sometimes art is influential, right? Like, so as much as I've said that, you know, art isn't going to end racism, which is true, there are some specific circumstances where art can be crucially quite important and impactful, right? Like I said, representation of minorities in popular TV shows, right? This looks like Glee having representation of queer individuals from, you know, all the way back in like 2009, I think it started. And it's like, you know what, that's actually hugely influential for young people who are questioning their sexuality to have that kind of representation. Or this looks like Hamilton or Amadeus having that representation of ethnic minority artists having access to that kind of audience. It means that it makes that, you know, like if pop groups exist, it means that more celebrities of minority status are capable about coming and speaking about things, right? Like if you've got an artist who's experienced significant racism in their time and they become really popular, they're therefore significantly more able to come out and talk about the ways that they've been experiencing that level of racism, right? Like this looks like female movie stars discussing things like pay gaps in the film industry, and then that has knock-on impacts for our capacity outside of the art world to talk about pay gaps existing, because as soon as things become normalized and popularized in mainstream media, they become normalized and popularized in our mainstream discussions in everyday life. And so that is a way that people can be influenced and influential in artwork. And then the second thing here is like actually the usage of art in authoritarian countries, whether that's, you know, North Korea doing that display for the was it the Olympics, where they had like a huge number of people participating in that display, and that was meant to be influential in a show of power. You know, or things like national anthems being hugely impactful. Is it Tchaikovsky in Shostakovich? One of them, I think it's Shostakovich in his Fifth Symphony, had massive cannons, and Stalin got scared by the massive cannons, and that actually became like a bit of a thing in Russia. Don't use that in a debate without checking that that's like true. But you know, there's influences where either subversion or of authoritarian regimes or usage of art by authoritarian regimes can be somewhat influential within that, about, you know, accessing an outside audience or questioning the regime in and of itself. It's also important in terms of the representation of those regimes. If there's a censorship of artwork, then how does that impact in that sense? So don't assume that nothing can be changed and that therefore there's no point in trying to argue anything, or that it's just all about, like, you know, whether or not people laugh at a TV show, right? There are things that can be achieved in debating and in art motions. I think it's just about being very specific and understanding the specific ways that each motion can be influential. So then I think it's important that you understand tracking. In order to have achievable burdens, you need to actually know what's going on in the debate and what other people have said. This is especially true because a lot of the time art motions, or not a lot of the time, sometimes art motions can be quite shallow. That means that there's not a lot of cases that can be made. So if you're in bottom half, you might be filling in analytical gaps that exist in top half, or you might be making the choice about whether or not you want to strategically limit the debate, you know, from closing and be like, you know what, top half have talked about so much random things that are not important, or whatever, right? Like, this is important. Art debates are impossible to win in like the abstract sense of you make a case that doesn't necessarily interact with anything else. And this is obviously just true with debating generally, but it's particularly true, I think, in art debates about that. If you want to know how to track, watch the SSDC training video on it. Shout out to William. So then I think that the important thing in closing especially, but also in opening, is knowing what hasn't been proven on top half. This means that your critiques and your capacity to fill in gaps comes at what you're capable of proving actually does change, right? Like the delta or the change in a debate is the most important thing. And particularly in art motions where you're questioning whether or not anything changes, it's important to have that security and clarity on what actually is shifting. And so then the important thing is also just knowing that you have proven a watertight way of change, or like, you know, debate. And then this also means, and this is crucial, that weighing within debating and weighing within the debate is absolutely necessary, right? Like if you're trying to say that, you know, you're not ending racism, but you make one person really happy, you need to explain why that is the most significant thing within the debate. I'm sure that there either is or will be an SSDC video on how to weigh, but you should just know how to do that. But like, whether it's like, you know what, this is a definite impact, everyone else is not doing a definite, or this person is incredibly vulnerable and so therefore their happiness is really important, or like, you know, whatever it is, right? Like you just need to make sure that you're highlighting the reasons as to why your impact, even if it's small, is the one that is winning the debate, whether it's because of just like definitive proof or you know, how much we care about that individual. Whatever it is, just make sure that you are actually proving and weighing that. And then I think that we just want to talk through some motions. I think that it's really hard to talk about or understand debating in abstract sense, so I just thought that it would be useful to talk through the motions. I realise that this video is almost all going to be longer than my last video, but I actually think that I've been really good and that this has been useful. So there. Okay, motion number 1. This is from the St Andrews Open 2022. It is, this house opposes women sexualizing themselves in media. So I'm just going to run through some questions that immediately come into my mind when I see these motions. I've actually debated the first two. Actually, I've debated all of these before, so But I'm not gonna answer any of these questions. I'm just gonna list off some questions that I think are useful to ask yourself when you're going through these motions, and then if you think about these and come up with some kind of answers, that's quite useful. Not looking at this from any particular side, just looking at this from some kind of like, immediate thoughts when you see the motion on the screen. So this house opposes women sexualizing themselves in media. I think that it's important that you know what this looks like, right? Like we're probably talking about songs like WAP by Cardi B, or films that are depicting women in a more sexual light. But a lot of time things like music are probably quite like the central way in which women sexualize themselves. Note the fact that this is women sexualizing themselves in media, so if women were to stop, right, like if we were to not have women sexualizing themselves, then it's important to ask like who else is doing this. So I think that having a woman's voice about how they feel in a sexual capacity is probably different than how a man talks about a woman in a sexual capacity. So why do we oppose one but not necessarily the other, or rather why are we centering ourselves on the opposition of one? This motion could also be done, I think, as an actor's motion, where it's like this house as the feminist movement opposes, or this house as a woman opposes, and I think that these arguments become sort of tangibly potentially stronger when you're like, well, the feminist movement opposing women sexualizing themselves looks really bad for all of these reasons. And then I think that another impact of this is sex sells as a general rule. Like media that surrounds sex or sexiness generally does quite well. Like songs like WAP are really popular, and they're really popular for a reason. People like consuming things that are about that. And so what is the sales or economic advantage of women who choose to sexualize themselves in media, right? Probably a definite impact of this is that if I sexualize myself through a song, if I am more likely therefore to achieve success with that song, that probably means that I have more money than I had before, and women being economically advantaged is probably like a popular or good thing. That's potentially an argument for opposition in this. Full disclosure, I was opposition when I did this motion, which is probably why this is where my thoughts are coming from. But those are some important questions to ask yourself, and I think that economic point is probably quite an important one. Motion 2. This is from Durham IV 2022 this year. This house believes that the representation of nihilism in art does more harm than good. There are some questions that you want to ask yourself here. I think that consumption and production are probably important to be thought of, right? Like this is like not more harm than good is a relatively abstract sense. We're talking about like what are the likely impacts, like positive and negative, that have happened, and then we're comparing them. So a bad thing to do would be to say nihilism has only done bad things. It's to say that the things that nihilism has done that are bad, for example, blah blah blah, are worse than the things that nihilism has done that are good. So the consumption and production aspect of this are important, right? Like does producing nihilistic art, is it cathartic, or whatever. And then also just on the consumption side, who's actually going to be consuming this? What does it look like? Are we talking about like negative or positive portrayals? So are we talking about like people consuming things and thinking that nihilism is really good? Are we talking about people consuming things and better understanding what nihilism is? Blah blah blah. This motion did have an info slide, FYI, about what nihilism was, but I do think that it's important that you talk about the way that gets portrayed through media and how people can therefore consume it, and that's probably quite those are some sort of important questions to be asking yourself when you look at this motion. Number 3, apologies to Imperial IV 2021. I don't really like this motion, and just trigger warning about things like self-harm, self-sacrifice and stuff. The motion is this house regrets the aestheticization of suffering. I hate that word, it's so hard. This is talking about things like portrayals of negative and harmful events coming across in like a positive way, or just in a beautiful way. So there was that film about that guy. This is awful. There's that film about that guy, and the actor sort of like physically starved himself, and the portrayals of him within the film were really graphic. Like you could see a lot. It was a very graphic detailing of what it looked to suffer from starvation. Actually, I think this is most probably central for things like religious artwork, like portrayals of Jesus Christ suffering on a cross, or just suffering through life. these are all kind of instances of artwork where that's taking place. But note the fact that this is a regrets motion, so this happens in the historical, this is a retrospective. What does it look like if aestheticization had never happened? So if we'd never seen this kind of positive or beautiful depiction of suffering, what's the change that happens there? So that's an important thing to consider. And then I think the impacts are also crucial in this, right? Like, does the consumption of positive images or aesthetic images of suffering impact people? If so, is it make them more capable of dealing with their own suffering, or does it mean suffering is generally perceived as less significant than it is? Is it more difficult, therefore, for people to achieve help? Is this another form of catharsis for artists in the creation of this artwork that aestheticizes suffering? I think there's a lot of things that you can talk through within this. Moving on then to motion number 4. This is from the International Art Open 2021. The motion reads, "This House believes that majoritarian artists producing genres created by minority communities, e.g. jazz, rap, techno, should be required to pay a significant portion of their royalties to artists from those communities." First of all, this is an awards motion, so there's no fiat that takes place, so therefore you have to have a reasonable amount of conversation about how this actually would take place and what this looks like, right? Are we talking about like donations to community funds, to museums, like physically handing money over to other artists within the like jazz, rap or techno communities, for example, right? Like that's actually probably where a significant amount of this debate takes place, is on what this actually looks like. But additionally, that means that the perception of the donation or the perception of the handing of the money is also important, right? Does this mitigate the potential harm that stealing from these movements by majoritarian artists does? Like Eminem as a rapper, how much has he co-opted a movement that probably originated in a different community than his, for his own political gains? Or, you know, jazz becoming gentrified in a lot of ways when it originally was kind of, you know, it was, I think it originated on like New Orleans as that kind of what's it called, sort of politically oppositional, I guess, movements, like musical movements, I think are all important, right? Like we're talking about the way that these majoritarian artists are potentially stealing. So does them donating them to these communities mitigate that harm, or does it bring more attention to the harm that they're potentially causing? Do all majoritarian artists become, you know, successful? How does this disincentivize people from doing that if they potentially would? What are we talking about there in terms of all of these? I think that this motion's got a lot of you know, detail in that sense. And then also I just think there's a couple of principal cases that are here, like, right, like the ownership of art, like the principle of this obligation aspect to communities' own art, to people kind of how do what genres evolve and change and shift, and, you know, what is this kind of centering on? I think there's quite a lot to be discussed here. So that's just a brief discussion about some particular motions that I hopefully situates some of the more abstract conversation that we've had within these. So finally, just some final sort of takeaways on this. 1, minimize the debate, but don't do it badly. 2, art motions are fun. I will stand by this until I die. 3, weighing is crucial and really important. 4, and potentially novelly, you can use art analysis elsewhere, right? Like you can just talk about it within debates where it doesn't seem immediately relevant, right? Like if it doesn't have art in the motion, that doesn't mean that you can't talk about the importance or dissemination of artwork and that kind of thing. Whether you should is another question that I'm not going to answer because this video is too long. But yeah, art motions are fun. Enjoy them. Don't do them badly, please.